Hello, welcome to Conversation with the Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and we're very fortunate today to have Cadey Korson, who's on the faculty at Massey University of New Zealand. And Cadey Korson is one of our distinguished alumni from GRCC. Cadey, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's great to have you. And as I talk with others who have taken part in this series, I'll ask you about things that sparked your interest in geography. And first, I'll ask you to reflect upon your childhood here in Western Michigan. Was there anything in Western Michigan that might have drawn your interest to geography?
Well, I don't know that it's something particular to this area, but when I was in middle school, I had the opportunity to take part in the People-to-People Student Ambassador Program. I think the first one was when I was in 8th grade, and so that trip took me to Southern Europe, and that was really what sparked my interest in learning about other places and other cultures. And then I was subsequently able to go on another one of those trips, and really from there it just took off with an interest in travel.
So you were interested in traveling to other places, exploring other places, and learning about people and places, really when you were in high school?
Yeah, and unfortunately my high school only offered one geography course, so I wasn't able to do it a lot in high school, but I knew when I came to CC that was one of the things, among others, that I wanted to look into studying.
And would you elaborate on some of your early CC experiences that sparked this notion, like in your studies of geography? What was it that captivated you?
I think it was the same stuff that, got me really interested in traveling. Just the idea that, West Michigan is this very small place in a very large world, and that I actually knew very little about the rest of the world. And it was something that I was quite keen to explore more of. And so I guess if we're talking about the first beginnings of my focus area, it was really cultural geography was what drew me in. So when I was taking your class, I think that was the first geography class I took at CC was the cultural geography one, and that was quite fascinating. And the field trips that we took as part of that really opened my eyes to new ways of thinking, which, looking back, I think was what I liked about travel. Was just exploring these different ways of looking at the world. So that was really where my interest started.
Some of the field trips really sparked that desire to learn more. Then it's interesting that it's so difficult nowadays to incorporate field trips into courses because of liability issues, and you've probably face that too. Do you face that in New Zealand, by the way?
Yeah, a little bit. I haven't led any field trips in my courses yet, but I'm planning to for this upcoming year. So we'll see how that goes. And they seem to be just figuring out what types of agreements need to be signed and consents and things to allow students to go on those trips. But yeah, there's concerns around those as well.
So from GRCC, then you went to Aquinas College, and you were pursuing a couple of different studies, weren't you? I
was, yeah. So I think I kind of lucked out in the level of overlap between my interest areas, because I did manage to major in 3 things. So geography first and foremost, international relations, and then French as well, because I really wanted to try and continue with that. And yeah, it was a great experience. Really good professors. I quite liked the small liberal arts college feel, much smaller classes, able to really get to know professors in a way that I think you just can't sometimes at large.
There was a lot of attention given, I guess, to preparation for graduate school, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was. And I mean, certainly your mentorship all through that process was a big part of that. But at each stage, I really had supervisors that were looking out for me and sort of guiding me on this.
Can you comment on some of them at Aquinas that, in ways in which they really helped you?
Yeah, so when I was there, Paul Bieneman was still there, and I believe he was still the chair of the department at the time. And both he and Rich McCluskey really helped me look at, and you as well, helped me look at what types of master's programs might be a good fit, sort of talked me through that process, helped me think about what types of experiences, what skills I needed to prepare and to have a competitive application for that. So all of those things, in addition to my coursework, of course, was what set me up for grad school.
And you really developed that interest in international relations, which facilitated that inclination to steer toward geopolitics, I guess.
Yeah, certainly. And through my master's and PhD programs, we were encouraged to take cognate courses. So for example, when I was at the University of Missouri doing my master's, my cognate was political science. And I also had somebody from the French program, who was involved in my master's thesis. And then when I went on to my PhD, it was history, but all those things were continuously interwoven, and I think are now reflected in the fields that I work in.
Well, we certainly have a wonderful discipline that is interdisciplinary in many ways, though we focus on place. Let's talk about the University of Missouri. You conducted a really interesting bit of research in reference to your master's thesis associated with UN peacekeeping forces, perceptions, and social media. Would you care to talk about that for a minute?
Sure.
I mean, it might seem like a long time ago, but it was...
It does, and in some ways I'm still carrying on with some of the theory that formed that research and the media components, but in other ways I'm quite distanced from the topic of that research. But so I knew that I wanted to continue with research in Francophone regions. So the case study of that was the Ivory Coast and Haiti. But what I was looking at, as you said, were the perceptions of the peace kept, so the Haitians, the people in the Ivory Coast, what their perceptions of the UN were. And I was evaluating those or surveying those through different types of media. So I had the traditional news outlets and journalism, both at the domestic and international level, but then I also had citizen journalism, so very ground up type, kind of newsletter style newspapers, as well as Twitter. Twitter had been around for a little bit by then, but it was still a fairly new platform. So looking at how people in those countries and around the world were talking about these peacekeeping operations. And my idea at the time was that looking at these news resources could then be an evaluative tool for the UN to take those opinions into account and to then improve the peacekeeping missions, especially in a place like Haiti that had had such a long and somewhat conflicted history with the UN peacekeepers.
Well, it was striking, and it ended up being published in the Professional Geographer, if I'm not mistaken.
It did, yeah. The first article was in Professional Geographer. The second one was in Geopolitics. And I was quite fortunate that I was able to get publications out of my master's thesis and do that while I was doing a PhD.
And then when you pursued a PhD, you ventured to Kent State. And can you comment on the faculty at Kent State that inspired you, that directed you, that influenced you?
Sure. So when I went to Kent State, it was at a time of a lot of change. So they had just added 3 new positions when I came. While I was there, they had 3 new positions that were filled. So the faculty was really growing, which of course is of great benefit to graduate students. And they had a really good ratio of faculty to grad students. So again, continuing this, getting a lot of attention. So my supervisor was Dave Kaplan, who I think is quite well known, his personality throughout the geography community. But yeah, I could certainly see that my research shifted a bit as with my supervisors, I suppose, as we went along. So he really influenced my interest in national identity, for example. So within my PhD dissertation, there's a whole section on national identity. So he opened my eyes to that component of it. But I also had a assistant professor who was part of my committee, who did a lot of work with local community. And so she influenced me in showing me examples of how you can work with local communities on policy type things, or other just community building projects. So that's been something that's been quite helpful now. And then there was another faculty member there who is actually at the regional campus, and I took one of his courses on memory and heritage, I think it was called. And in taking that course and doing a final project on commemoration in New Caledonia, which is where my dissertation fieldwork was on, I actually ended up doing this side project while I was doing my dissertation research on commemoration and national identity in New Caledonia. And so now that's been this avenue of research that I sort of continue to play with as I find the time.
Well, it's striking in the way in which the cultural landscape reflects this notion of commemoration, memorializing events and people.
Yeah.
And there is this evolution, that's for sure. I've noticed that in Africa myself.
Certainly, certainly.
It's fascinating.
It is, and in the class we read several books on commemoration in the U.S., of course, because that's where we were based. But we read this one particular book about the National Mall in Washington, D.C. And I'd been there a few times, and I'd seen the statues and the memorials and thought, oh, that's nice, whatever. But reading that book and then having discussions in class really opened my eyes to all of the meaning embedded in those, not just the design, but the placement, thinking about people's reactions to the monuments and memorials, whether it's the intended outcome of the artist or something completely different, and then traveling around and looking at commemoration through graffiti and street art. This very ground up sort of democratic process of commemorating. So, once you have that geographic lens, you can't turn it off. So you start seeing these things all over. Yeah.
It's a blessing and a curse for others, I suppose, as we engage in our explorations of landscape.
Yes.
It is. You comment on this project associated with commemoration as a side project. Didn't you also engage in some research associated with geographic education, world regional geography? Talk about that for a moment.
So I don't like to just stick with one avenue of research. In order to keep myself engaged, I tend to have a few different research focuses. And one of those is geography education, something I'm actually quite passionate about, improving geography education, making it more relevant for students. And how that started out was one of my peers in graduate school. We were both teaching the same type of course, world regional geography, and had quite a history of teaching it by this point. And so we got together and we thought, let's write an article about how we teach world geography, because she was very much a classicist, I suppose, teaching regional geography from a regional perspective, which makes sense, I suppose. But I had become really interested in teaching it thematically, which is quite different. There are very few textbooks that are oriented thematically.
For any region, for any regional textbook.
Right, exactly, let alone some kind of world textbook. So we put together this article looking at the different approaches to teaching world geography and did a small survey around that, pooling opinions from people we knew, but also other interested parties who are keen to learn more about different approaches to teaching world geography. And we put it all together in the article. And that sort of led into other co-authored articles with Veronica Kusek, who's now at Northern Michigan. So we did a book chapter piece on pop culture and migration and geography education, and then I just had an article published in Geopolitics teaching geopolitics with Max Brooks's World War Z. So what zombies can teach us about.
I see. The geography of zombies now has entered academe.
It has.
Okay. Let's talk about your dissertation in New Caledonia, because this is essentially an untouched region by Americans and American geographers.
Sure. It is.
So you decided to expand your interests really in Francophone regions, especially developing world areas. And you end up in New Caledonia conducting field work. When you arrived in New Caledonia, what were your first thoughts upon arrival?
It was colder than I expected. so
South Pacific, huh?
Yeah, exactly. South of the equator, which I didn't realize at the time meant that the seasons are swapped. So even though they're close enough to really only have a rainy and a dry season, it was still quite cold at the time that I visited. So that was my initial thought, was it's a bit chillier than I thought it was going to be. But aside from that, I was picked up by a university professor, Matthias Shosha, who works at the University of New Caledonia, and I'd liaised with before going there. And he was driving me into Noumea, which is the capital city, and we were just chatting along the drive. It was quite rainy, getting towards evening, but as I looked up sort of down on one side of the road and up on the other side of the road, into these, sort of hilly, vegetated areas, I was seeing all these houses kind of peeking through. And so I asked him about it, just to make conversation. And he was like, oh, those are the squats. And I said, the squats, what are those? And he proceeded to tell me about all of these informal settlements that had been really expanding over the last couple decades around the capital city. And so that was also something interesting, not necessarily pertaining to my dissertation, the research I was there to do, but subsequently sparked an interest in housing and indigenous perspectives on housing. But yeah, those were my initial impressions, and then as I was there longer, I visited more of the islands. Yeah, quite different than I expected though, which I think is the reason why we do field work. Nothing is ever as we read on paper.
We do have preconceived notions so
do.
often that are eliminated oftentimes upon our, if not initial encounter engaging in field work, then over a brief period of time, if we're doing it correctly, this kind of qualitative work.
Yeah, so before I went to New Caledonia, I kind of expected it to be, maybe not as built up as some place like Hawaii, but I kind of expected it to look like Hawaii, with nicer neighborhoods, not as nice neighborhoods, very condensed city center, but pretty well developed. And New Caledonia reminded me much more of the type of landscape you'd see in the Caribbean, where it's not quite as developed. You certainly see the result of a presence of tourism to some extent, but in a bit of the colonial architecture, but actually not as much as I thought that there would be. It's more of that kind of concrete post-war style architecture in the city center.
Would you elaborate on your dissertation research just for a few moments?
Sure. So my dissertation looked at political development in New Caledonia, and I was there in 2014, so it was 4 years before the referendum, which just took place in November. So I was talking with the politicians, most of whom are still very active and will probably continue to be active through any future referenda. And I was keen to talk to those who are in the territorial Congress, like the main body of government there, the main legislative body of government. And I talked with both loyalists and nationalists, so individuals who were both pro and anti-independence. And I was just really interested to hear what their arguments for or against the referendum on sovereignty were. And so it was pretty open-ended in my interviews. I wasn't really sure what was going to happen, which is part of my own methodology. And so we talked about all kinds of things which can generally be categorized around this concept of rebalancing. That for both pro and anti-independence political leaders, it was all about rebalancing inequalities, whether they were economic, whether they were social, whether they were political. And so that then took different forms depending on who I was talking to, because of course pro-independence, the whole idea is making a break with France, having more control over the economy, as well as the politics of the country, whereas loyalists were more about negotiating partnerships with France, continuing that relationship of association. And I generally found that loyalist politicians had this very Republican view of equality, in the sense that self-determination, these sorts of things were for all inhabitants of New Caledonia, whereas the pro-independence nationalist politicians were much more focused on, Canuck rights, first of all, rights of the indigenous peoples, of course, which were then shared with some other people who had resided in New Caledonia for a long time, some of whom who had been colonized themselves in ways by France, even if they were from metropolitan France. But were
the former convicts or the descendants of convicts.
Yes, exactly,
others,
as well as forced laborers who'd come from other French colonies in the Pacific. But we're also open to giving those rights to somewhat more recent migrants as well, but there was a definite cutoff. So there was a lot of disagreement around that as far as this idea of political rebalancing. So that's what I looked at, and it took a variety of twists and turns, but those core concepts around rebalancing.
And recently, well, just last month, there was a referendum.
Yes. Yep, the first. Well, the first of these three. There were, of course, ones with the prior peace accords. But yes, so the Noumea Accord, which was in 1998, set up this process for a devolution of powers from France to New Caledonia, which is irreversible. Everything but the 5 sort of sovereign powers is what they call them. And 2018 was sort of the final deadline. They always push it right up until the last minute. Can't get much later than November. And so on November 4th, they had the first referendum on sovereignty. And of course, as you've now heard, the answer was no against sovereignty, which I don't think was really a surprise for anyone. What was surprising, of course, was how close it was, something like 56 to about 44%. Even the pro-independence political leaders, I think, were quite surprised that it was so close.
And there was a pretty large turnout as well, wasn't
there was, yes. They estimated that 80% of eligible voters turned out for it, which is really good.
It is. It's amazing. It would be nice if we could do that in this country, I think. But
they do have a smaller population to work with.
but they will hold another referendum in the future, and perhaps the results will even be closer at that time.
Yeah, so because the way that the Noumea Accord is set up, there can be 3 possible referendums. So the first one was this year. The next one is scheduled more or less for 2020. And then if that's again a no, then they'll do a third one in 2022. So we'll see what happens in the next 2 years, especially since it was so close.
Well, and New Caledonia is so vital, not only because of the nickel deposits, but because of its strategic location and its strategic location, especially in reference to Chinese interests in the area. Yeah,
exactly. So I think especially from an American and quite often from a European perspective too, just because I've taught in Europe, I have a little bit of a sense. These small islands in the Pacific are quite peripheral to us geographically, but they're also quite peripheral in our thinking. You know, so for most of us, I think we don't really have a good sense of what the strategic value of these very small islands in the middle of this vast ocean, what their significance would be. But they actually are quite significant, which is why the US, the UK, France, Australia, New Zealand all have maintained interest throughout the Pacific region. You know, and certainly for France, Australia as well, the US, Japan, there is a very active interest in, you know, maintaining these kind of spheres of influence, if you will, in the Pacific to counterbalance Chinese expansion. You know, looking for resources, but also business opportunities in these small island states.
Certainly. You mentioned experience in Europe. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure. So after my PhD, I went straight into a postdoctoral appointment in human geography at the University of Oulu in Finland, which is about midway up Finland. So we were only 2 hours south of the Arctic Circle. I thought I was used to cold, snow, and darkness in Michigan, but it's got nothing on Finland.
Really?
Yes.
Thanks for the tip.
Yeah. There's definitely a beauty in 23 hours of darkness, but there's also an adjustment that's required. Yeah, so I was doing a 2-year postdoc there under the supervision, more or less, of Anssi Passi, who is quite well known for his work in national identity. Historically, now he's doing more around regions and borders. Working within the geography department, but also in association with the Relate Center of Excellence that they've established there. And that was a wonderful experience. The postdoc was almost entirely research-based, and I had a lot of leeway about what I wanted to study, a lot of funding to go and study what I wanted, and I only had to teach 1 class per year. And they teach their classes in the geography department quite differently. They are 10-day classes for their undergraduate students. So 4 days one week, 4 days another week, and then 2 days, and then they're done. It's quite different from what I was used to.
That's pretty concentrated.
It is, but you would expect in that type of situation that the class times would be longer, but they're still only an hour and a half or 2 hours. So you have to figure out how to fit a semester's worth of, you know, I think I figured out something like 25 hours worth of coursework would be condensed into just those 10 hours or
Wow.
11 hours.
Well, that's a challenge.
It is, it is. It was a very different way of approaching the subject, but it was quite enjoyable. And every time I move to a new country and teach students from new countries, it's a learning experience for me too. You know, to be able to learn how they see the world, what is interesting to them, you know, what they're eager to learn more about.
So in that regard, just say a few words about New Zealand. You know, at Massey, my goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, Auckland is a fine city.
It is, it is. I've never been to Seattle, but it's what I imagine Seattle to be like. You know, so it's a port city. The city center itself is fairly small, but the suburbs are quite expansive. They've definitely taken on wholeheartedly the American approach to urban sprawl, fully embraced it, which is not great for traffic. It's a car culture. But other than that, it's the first time I've ever lived near a large city. And so that's been quite nice, having the opportunity to go into town. There's always something that's going on. So having that aspect of...
There's a certain majesty to Auckland, I think.
Yeah, and it's really been changing over the last decade as well. I think Māori presence in the city is really growing, not in the sense of more Māori indigenous peoples moving to the city because they've been there for a very long time, but there are some very key and well-placed individuals within local councils, within urban design, architecture, transport, you know, who are sitting in all of these organizations, as well as the iwi, the tribes themselves, that have gained a lot of power, a lot of economic, financial power as well through the settlements process, and they're really using that to their advantage to put their stamp on the city.
Well, that's certainly a stark contrast then to Australia and other places, really, that have only recently considered, or more recently considered, I guess, facilitating greater empowerment among the indigenous.
Yeah. So I was doing an interview at the new Auckland City Council building, and the person who I was interviewing, he took me upstairs to the place that we were doing the interview, and he was so excited. We walked onto the elevator, and he's like, "Okay, just listen." Okay. And the numbers for the floors were in Te Reo Māori. And he was so excited because it was a huge accomplishment. And for a country that is officially bilingual, it's not like going to Quebec and seeing the signs in French and English. They're still a long ways from that. And so those kinds of small things are just slowly...
But your generation is more inclined to be bilingual, or those that are indigenous are more inclined to have mastery of the tongue than, say, my generation, as there was that initiative that pushed for bilingualism.
Yeah, and there has certainly been this type of renaissance to encourage young people especially, but also older people as well, to take Te Reo Māori courses. So our university has made this commitment to being Tiriti-led, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, and part of that has been an effort to offer staff and faculty courses in Māori. So we have sort of the general ones that are, you know, available to students as well, but they've just released this, they call them MOOCs. It's like these online course platforms called Toromai, which is sort of an introductory to Te Reo. So I've been starting to go through that.
That's an interesting experiment for connecting with students of all ethnic backgrounds.
It is, yeah. I think when they first rolled it out, they had something like 10 or 20,000 people sign up within the first month, all over the world, not just in New Zealand either.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cadey, we're going to have to close in a moment, but I'm going to ask you to reflect for a few seconds on any recommendations you might have for students interested in geography as a career, or graduate students seeking to gain employment in academia, or one who just might wish to pursue their passions in geography. Do you have any comments, any suggestions, any recommendations you might make?
Sure. I think the best advice I ever got was actually from an 8th grade English teacher who said, plan your work and work your plan. That's what I tell all of my students, and it's just a good rule of thumb, no matter what kind of advice I'm giving to whichever audience. But geography has certainly enabled me to pursue the things that I'm most passionate about and interested in. We started out by talking about how my first interest in geography came from travel. Mm-hmm. So in the last 3 years, I think I've visited maybe 10 or 15 countries. So geography has enabled me to do that. To some extent, working in academia and continuing my degree has definitely enabled me to do that. So along with all of the stresses of going on to graduate school and doing a PhD entails, there are amazing benefits to it as well. And I've been able to meet so many interesting people from other places because I've done that. And my advice to anybody who's considering a master's or a PhD, and definitely to someone who's considering continuing on in academia, in this climate, you really have to be willing to move, and you have to be open to the idea of being mobile and to moving to another place, because it can actually be an incredible experience. Even for somebody who may be a bit hesitant about living in another place, whether it's in the US or somewhere else in the world. But that certainly shaped my experience into a very positive one.
Cadey, thank you so much for joining us. And this concludes our conversation with the Geographer interview. Thank you.